When the ambush hit Convoy Delta-7, Sergeant Miller's radio crackled with his commander's final order: abort mission. Return to base immediately. But Miller looked at the 20 trucks filled with life-saving supplies and the 2,000 soldiers counting on those deliveries. Sometimes following orders means watching your brothers starve. Sometimes breaking orders means bringing them home. The fuel gauge showed half empty, the GPS calculated 50 miles through hostile territory, and every instinct told him to abandon the mission. But those trucks contained medical supplies that would save lives, ammunition that would win battles, and food that would keep American soldiers fighting another day. In the scorching heat of western Iraq, Convoy Delta-7 had been designated as a routine supply run designed to resupply forward operating base Phoenix with critical materials that would sustain combat operations for the next 30 days. 20 heavy-duty transport trucks loaded with essential supplies represented the lifeline between rear echelon logistics and frontline combat effectiveness that kept American forces operational in hostile territory. Sergeant Marcus Miller commanded the convoy escort with 8 years of military experience and over 200 successful supply missions throughout Iraq and Afghanistan. His expertise included convoy security, route reconnaissance, and tactical logistics that had earned him commendations from multiple commanding officers and the respect of every soldier who had served under his leadership during high-risk operations. The convoy's cargo was critically important to maintaining operational readiness at FOB Phoenix. 10 trucks carried medical supplies including surgical equipment, antibiotics, plasma, and trauma kits that would determine whether wounded soldiers lived or died during the next month of combat operations. 5 trucks transported ammunition reserves including rifle rounds, mortar shells, and rocket-propelled grenades that would provide firepower advantage during enemy engagements. The remaining 5 trucks contained food, water, fuel, and maintenance equipment that would keep 2,000 American soldiers fed, hydrated, and combat-ready in an environment where logistics failure meant mission failure. Miller's escort team consisted of 12 experienced soldiers riding in 4 armed Humvees positioned strategically throughout the convoy formation. Lieutenant Rodriguez commanded the lead vehicle with advanced communication equipment and route navigation systems. The 26-year-old officer from Texas had earned his commission through officer candidate school after serving 2 years as an enlisted infantryman. His tactical knowledge combined book learning with practical experience gained during 18 months of combat deployments in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Johnson provided rear security with heavy weapons capable of suppressing enemy attacks from behind. Johnson, a career soldier with 14 years of military service, had trained extensively in crew-served weapons and possessed the kind of steady nerves under fire that came from surviving multiple enemy contacts during previous deployments. His .50 caliber machine gun and Mark 19 grenade launcher represented significant firepower that could engage enemy forces at extended ranges. Corporals Thompson and Wilson operated the middle security vehicles that protected the convoy's most vulnerable sections during movement through dangerous territory. Thompson, a former mechanic from Detroit, understood vehicle vulnerabilities and optimal positioning for maximum protection. Wilson, who had grown up hunting in rural Montana, possessed exceptional marksmanship skills and the patience required for overwatch operations during extended convoy movements. Each escort team member had completed multiple deployment rotations and possessed extensive experience in convoy security operations. Their collective expertise represented thousands of hours of combat experience, advanced tactical training, and proven performance under fire that had successfully completed hundreds of supply missions without losing a single truck or cargo shipment. The team had developed unspoken communication methods, instinctive tactical responses, and the kind of mutual trust that only came from surviving dangerous situations together repeatedly. The planned route to FOB Phoenix covered 50 miles of Iraqi desert through terrain that intelligence reports classified as moderate risk for enemy activity. Recent reconnaissance conducted by unmanned aerial vehicles and special operations teams suggested minimal hostile presence along their designated route, with no significant enemy capabilities that could threaten a well-defended convoy traveling at optimal speed with appropriate security measures. The route had been selected through detailed analysis of terrain features, historical attack patterns, civilian population density, and proximity to known enemy strongholds. Military intelligence officers had spent weeks analyzing satellite imagery, studying previous convoy movements, and consulting with local informants to identify the safest possible path between the logistics base and FOB Phoenix. Alternative routes existed, but they involved either significantly longer distances or passage through areas with confirmed enemy presence. Weather forecasts indicated clear conditions with minimal wind that would provide excellent visibility for convoy operations and reduce dust interference with communication equipment. Temperature predictions suggested daytime highs reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring careful attention to vehicle cooling systems and personnel hydration throughout the journey. Sandstorm possibilities remained minimal according to meteorological reports. At 0600 hours on what appeared to be another routine Tuesday morning, Convoy Delta-7 departed the main logistics base with full fuel tanks, complete ammunition loads, and communication equipment tested and verified operational. Each vehicle had undergone comprehensive mechanical inspections during the previous evening, with particular attention to engine cooling systems, transmission operation, and tire conditions that would be stressed during extended desert travel. Miller reviewed his convoy checklist one final time, confirming that each truck driver understood route procedures, communication protocols, and emergency actions that would be implemented if they encountered hostile activity during their journey. The civilian drivers, all experienced contractors who had completed dozens of similar missions, acknowledged their briefing with professional confidence that came from extensive experience in Iraqi transportation operations. Every detail had been planned, rehearsed, and executed according to standard operating procedures that had proven successful during hundreds of previous supply missions. Convoy spacing maintained optimal intervals that would prevent multiple vehicle destruction from single IED explosions while enabling mutual support during enemy contact. Communication checks verified that all vehicles could maintain contact with convoy leadership and respond to tactical commands during emergency situations. Miller's final radio check with Convoy Command confirmed favorable conditions for departure. Base, this is Delta-7 actual, 20 vehicles ready for movement, estimated arrival 1030 hours, weather clear, route confirmed, all systems operational. At 0723 hours, approximately 15 miles from their starting point, Convoy Delta-7 entered a canyon section where rocky hills provided natural concealment for enemy forces. The terrain channeled vehicle movement into a narrow corridor that limited maneuvering options while creating perfect conditions for coordinated ambush operations by enemies familiar with tactical advantages offered by local geography. The first indication of trouble came when Lieutenant Rodriguez's radio transmission was cut short mid-sentence while reporting routine position updates to Convoy Command. Base, this is Delta-7 lead, passing checkpoint Bravo 3, all vehicles operational. Estimated arrival, the transmission ended with static and the distinctive crack of high-velocity rifle fire. Multiple improvised explosive devices detonated simultaneously along both sides of the convoy route with precision timing that indicated sophisticated planning and detailed reconnaissance of American convoy procedures. The explosions sent massive clouds of dust, debris, and smoke into the air while creating craters that blocked forward and reverse movement through the canyon. Enemy fire erupted from concealed positions throughout the rocky hillsides with intensity that suggested at least 50 attackers armed with automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and mortars. The volume of incoming fire was overwhelming, creating a crossfire pattern that covered every vehicle in the convoy and eliminated most opportunities for effective counterattack or defensive maneuvering. Miller's Humvee was struck by an RPG that killed his driver instantly and left him temporarily unconscious with a severe concussion and multiple lacerations from flying glass and metal fragments. Private Johnson, a 19-year-old from Ohio who had been driving military vehicles for 8 months, died immediately upon impact without time to understand what was happening. His last words had been commenting on the scenic canyon walls that moments later became his tomb. When Miller regained consciousness 30 seconds later, which felt like hours in the compressed time of combat, the convoy had been transformed into a battlefield where burning vehicles, wounded soldiers, and desperate radio calls painted a picture of tactical disaster that exceeded every worst-case scenario they had rehearsed during training exercises. Lieutenant Rodriguez's lead vehicle had been destroyed by a direct hit that killed all 4 occupants, eliminating convoy command and control capabilities that would have coordinated defensive operations and called for backup support from nearby military units. The explosion had been so violent that vehicle parts were scattered across a 100-meter radius, making identification of individual casualties difficult and confirming that no one inside could have survived the blast. Staff Sergeant Johnson's rear security vehicle had suffered catastrophic damage from multiple RPG hits that left only one survivor who was too badly wounded to operate weapons systems or provide tactical assistance. Corporal Martinez, the lone survivor, had sustained severe burns across 60% of his body and was experiencing shock symptoms that made communication difficult and tactical coordination impossible. The middle security vehicles commanded by Corporals Thompson and Wilson had been disabled by IED explosions but maintained some fighting capability, though both corporals were wounded and their vehicles' communication equipment had been destroyed by blast effects and small arms fire. Thompson had suffered shrapnel wounds to his legs that limited mobility but didn't prevent weapon operation. Wilson had sustained a head injury that caused intermittent disorientation but didn't eliminate his combat effectiveness completely. Miller conducted a rapid battlefield assessment while automatic weapons fire continued from multiple directions, realizing that his escort team had been effectively eliminated as a fighting force within the first 3 minutes of contact. 8 soldiers were confirmed killed, 3 were critically wounded and unable to fight, and only Miller retained full combat effectiveness despite his own injuries and disorientation from the concussion that left him with double vision and ringing ears. The professional assessment was brutal but necessary. His convoy security had been eliminated, leaving 20 supply trucks and their civilian drivers completely defenseless against enemy forces who clearly intended to capture or destroy the valuable cargo that could sustain American combat operations for weeks. The 20 supply trucks remained mostly intact despite the intensity of the ambush, suggesting that enemy forces intended to capture the vehicles and their valuable cargo rather than simply destroying the convoy. However, most of the civilian truck drivers had been wounded during the initial attack, and those who remained uninjured were too terrified and disoriented to operate their vehicles under combat conditions. Miller's radio equipment had been damaged during the RPG strike, limiting his communication capabilities to short-range tactical frequencies that might not reach convoy command or nearby military units capable of providing backup support. Emergency beacons were functioning, but rescue operations would require hours to organize and deploy while enemy forces maintained tactical control of the engagement area. The tactical situation was catastrophic by any military assessment. Enemy forces controlled the high ground with superior numbers and firing positions. The convoy was trapped in a kill zone with limited mobility and virtually no defensive capabilities. Standard procedure dictated immediate withdrawal and abandonment of cargo to preserve remaining personnel and prevent additional casualties. But abandonment wasn't acceptable to Miller when he considered the consequences of losing those supplies. 2,000 American soldiers at FOB Phoenix were depending on medical equipment that would determine whether wounded warriors lived or died during upcoming operations. Combat effectiveness would be severely compromised without ammunition resupply that provided firepower advantage during enemy engagements. Food and water shortages would undermine morale and physical capability that kept soldiers fighting effectively in harsh desert conditions. Miller made the decision that defined his military career and potentially saved thousands of American lives. Instead of abandoning the convoy and calling for extraction, he would single-handedly shepherd 20 trucks through 50 miles of hostile territory to deliver supplies that his brothers in arms needed to survive and complete their mission. This wasn't just about disobeying orders or following regulations, it was about understanding that sometimes the right choice requires abandoning everything you've been taught about proper procedure and tactical wisdom. Miller knew that every military manual, every training exercise, and every commanding officer would classify his decision as tactically insane and operationally impossible. The decision violated every tactical manual and standard operating procedure that Miller had studied during 8 years of military service. Solo convoy operations were considered tactically impossible and essentially suicidal when attempted through hostile territory controlled by enemy forces with superior numbers and local knowledge advantages. But the human cost of abandoning those supplies transcended tactical considerations. Miller understood that his choice represented the difference between life and death for thousands of American soldiers who were depending on medical equipment, ammunition, and food supplies that would arrive only if he succeeded in completing an impossible mission. Miller thought about his own family, his wife Jennifer back in Kansas and their 2 young children who believed their father was a hero. He thought about the families of the 2,000 soldiers at FOB Phoenix who trusted that someone would bring the supplies they needed to survive another month of combat operations in the Iraqi desert. The weight of responsibility settled on Miller's shoulders like a physical burden that would accompany him throughout the next 50 miles of hostile territory. He wasn't just transporting cargo, he was carrying the hopes, dreams, and survival chances of people he had never met but who shared the common bond of American military service. Miller picked up his radio and transmitted the message that would end his military career while potentially saving thousands of lives. Base, this is Delta-7 actual. Convoy security has been eliminated, but cargo remains intact. I'm continuing mission to FOB Phoenix with available vehicles. Do not attempt rescue or interference. Miller out. The radio remained silent for several minutes before crackling with Commander Williams's angry response. Miller, you are ordered to abandon convoy and return to base immediately. Do not proceed with unauthorized mission. Acknowledge these orders immediately. Miller turned off his radio, picked up his weapon, and walked toward the first supply truck where a wounded civilian driver was waiting for instructions that would determine whether he lived or died during the next few hours. Miller began his impossible mission by moving from truck to truck under intense enemy fire, checking driver conditions and determining which vehicles could be operated by their original drivers versus which would require his direct operation. 12 drivers had been wounded during the ambush, with injuries ranging from minor cuts and bruises to serious wounds that required immediate medical attention. 8 truck drivers retained enough mobility and mental clarity to operate their vehicles under Miller's guidance, though several were obviously suffering from shock and combat stress that could affect their driving capability during extended operations. 4 drivers were too badly wounded to continue, requiring Miller to consolidate cargo into fewer vehicles while maintaining maximum supply delivery to FOB Phoenix. The cargo consolidation process required 30 minutes of dangerous work conducted while enemy fire continued sporadically from hillside positions. Miller transferred medical supplies, ammunition, and essential equipment from abandoned trucks into vehicles that could continue the mission, prioritizing materials that would have the greatest impact on combat effectiveness and soldier survival at their destination. Enemy forces seemed content to maintain pressure without pressing aggressive attacks, possibly because they preferred to capture intact supplies rather than destroy cargo that had significant value on black markets throughout the region. This tactical decision provided Miller with the time necessary to prepare his convoy for movement, though he understood that enemy patience would eventually expire. Miller established communication with the 8 remaining drivers using hand signals and voice commands, explaining their route, speed requirements, and emergency procedures that would be implemented if they encountered additional enemy contact during their journey. Most drivers showed remarkable courage despite their wounds and fear, understanding that their mission could save thousands of American lives. At 0815 hours, Miller led the modified convoy out of the ambush site using a service road that bypassed the main IED craters while accepting increased exposure to enemy fire from hillside positions. The movement was successful, though 2 additional trucks sustained minor damage from small arms fire that didn't prevent continued operation. 20 miles from the ambush site, Miller conducted his first tactical halt to assess vehicle conditions, driver status, and fuel consumption that would determine whether the convoy could reach FOB Phoenix without additional resupply. The assessment revealed serious problems that threatened mission success and convoy survival. Fuel consumption had exceeded planned rates due to increased engine loads, inefficient speeds caused by damaged vehicles, and extended idling during cargo consolidation procedures. Miller calculated that current fuel supplies would support approximately 35 miles of travel under optimal conditions, falling 15 miles short of their destination without considering additional consumption caused by challenging terrain and potential combat maneuvering. Several truck drivers were showing signs of deteriorating medical condition as shock and blood loss began affecting their driving capability. 2 drivers required immediate first aid treatment for wounds that had worsened during vehicle operation, and 1 driver was experiencing symptoms that suggested possible internal injuries requiring professional medical attention unavailable during convoy operations. Miller made difficult decisions about resource allocation and mission priorities while maintaining convoy security in an exposed position where enemy forces could potentially locate and attack their temporary position. He distributed remaining medical supplies among wounded drivers, administered pain medication from his personal first aid kit, and used emergency rations to provide energy for soldiers who hadn't eaten since before the ambush. The communication equipment check revealed that radio damage was more extensive than initially assessed. Miller's primary communication device could reach only 5 miles under ideal conditions, insufficient for maintaining contact with convoy command or requesting backup support from military units capable of providing fuel resupply or medical evacuation for wounded personnel. Miller addressed the convoy with honesty about their situation while maintaining leadership confidence that would keep morale stable during the challenging journey ahead. He explained that fuel supplies were limited but potentially adequate, that medical conditions were serious but manageable, and that their mission remained critical to supporting fellow soldiers who depended on their successful delivery. During the second day of travel, enemy forces began systematic harassment operations designed to slow convoy progress, increase fuel consumption, and create opportunities for ambush attacks that could capture or destroy remaining supplies. These tactics demonstrated sophisticated understanding of convoy vulnerabilities and suggested coordination between multiple enemy groups throughout the region. Roadside bombs were positioned at strategic locations where convoy routes channeled vehicles into predictable paths, forcing Miller to implement time-consuming counter-IED procedures that included route reconnaissance, explosive detection, and careful maneuvering that reduced travel speed while increasing fuel consumption. Each IED encounter required 30 minutes of careful navigation that ate into precious time and resources. Sniper attacks targeted truck drivers and vehicle systems with precision that suggested trained marksmen equipped with advanced optics and intimate knowledge of American vehicle weaknesses. Miller responded by varying convoy formation, implementing unpredictable movement patterns, and using available cover while maintaining forward progress toward their objective. Small unit attacks struck the convoy at vulnerable points during their journey, forcing Miller to implement defensive procedures that required aggressive maneuvering and return fire using his personal weapon and surviving vehicle-mounted systems. These engagements consumed ammunition while demonstrating that enemy forces were actively tracking convoy movement and coordinating attacks. Miller adapted his tactics continuously, implementing lessons learned from previous engagements while anticipating enemy methods that might be used during subsequent attacks. His experience and tactical knowledge allowed him to stay one step ahead of enemy planning, though the constant pressure was exhausting both physically and mentally. The psychological stress of solo leadership during extended combat operations began affecting Miller's decision-making capability as fatigue, stress, and combat trauma accumulated during days of continuous operations. Sleep deprivation, irregular nutrition, and constant alertness requirements pushed his physical endurance beyond normal human limits while maintaining responsibility for convoy success and driver survival. On the third day of convoy operations, mechanical failures began cascading through vehicles that had been damaged during the initial ambush and stressed by extended operations under combat conditions. Truck engines began overheating, transmission systems showed signs of failure, and tire damage accumulated to levels that threatened vehicle mobility throughout the convoy. 3 trucks developed critical mechanical problems that would prevent continued operation without immediate repair using tools and parts unavailable during field operations. Miller faced the agonizing decision of abandoning additional vehicles with their valuable cargo or attempting field repairs that would consume time and resources while exposing the convoy to enemy attacks. Miller chose to consolidate cargo once again, transferring the most critical medical supplies and ammunition into vehicles that retained operational capability while reluctantly abandoning supplies that could have saved American lives. Each abandoned case of medical equipment represented wounded soldiers who might die without proper treatment, but practical limitations made complete cargo delivery impossible. The cargo consolidation process revealed the true scope of supplies they had successfully transported despite impossible circumstances. Medical equipment worth millions of dollars remained intact, ammunition supplies that would sustain combat operations for weeks had survived enemy attacks, and food supplies that would feed soldiers for extended periods had been preserved through Miller's determination and tactical skill. Driver conditions continued deteriorating as wounds became infected, fatigue accumulated beyond safe operating levels, and combat stress began affecting judgment and reflexes necessary for safe vehicle operation. Miller provided medical care using his limited supplies while making difficult decisions about which drivers could continue operating versus which required rest that the convoy couldn't afford. Miller's own physical condition was becoming critical as days of combat stress, minimal sleep, and constant physical demands pushed his endurance toward complete collapse. His hands trembled from exhaustion, his vision occasionally blurred from fatigue, and his decision-making processes showed signs of impairment that could prove fatal during critical moments. With 15 miles remaining to FOB Phoenix, Miller's convoy consisted of 12 operational trucks carrying approximately 70% of their original cargo, 5 drivers who remained capable of vehicle operation, and 1 sergeant whose determination had overcome every obstacle that enemy forces and harsh conditions had created during their impossible journey. Fuel supplies had reached critical levels that would allow approximately 10 miles of travel under optimal conditions, requiring Miller to implement extreme conservation measures that reduced speed, eliminated unnecessary engine operation, and accepted increased vulnerability to enemy attacks in exchange for maximum fuel efficiency that might enable mission completion. Enemy pressure intensified as the convoy approached their objective, suggesting that hostile forces understood the strategic importance of preventing supply delivery to FOB Phoenix. Attacks became more frequent, more aggressive, and more coordinated as enemy commanders committed additional resources to stopping Miller's mission within sight of success. Miller contacted FOB Phoenix using emergency radio procedures that required maximum transmission power and clear weather conditions that enabled communication across the final 15 miles to their destination. The base commander acknowledged their approach and began preparation for cargo reception while expressing amazement that any portion of Convoy Delta-7 had survived the journey. The final movement phase required Miller to lead his remaining trucks through the most dangerous terrain of their entire journey, where enemy forces had concentrated maximum firepower to prevent supply delivery during the final miles before reaching safety. Artillery shells began impacting near convoy positions, automatic weapons fire intensified from multiple directions, and RPG attacks targeted individual vehicles with precision that demonstrated desperate enemy attempts to achieve mission failure. Miller implemented final tactical measures that committed all remaining resources to reaching FOB Phoenix regardless of casualties or equipment losses. He distributed remaining ammunition among drivers, explained final emergency procedures, and prepared for the decisive engagement that would determine whether their incredible journey ended in success or failure. At 1,347 hours on the 5th day after departing the main logistics base, Convoy Delta-7 surviving elements reached the perimeter of FOB Phoenix carrying critical supplies that would sustain 2,000 American soldiers during upcoming combat operations. Miller had successfully delivered medical equipment that would save hundreds of lives, ammunition that would provide tactical advantage during enemy engagements, and supplies that would maintain morale and combat effectiveness throughout the region. The base commander and logistics personnel immediately began unloading procedures while combat medics provided medical attention for wounded drivers who had displayed extraordinary courage during their impossible journey through hostile territory. Every soldier who participated in cargo reception understood that they were witnessing the conclusion of one of the most remarkable supply missions in military history. Miller's after-action report documented the tactical innovations, leadership decisions, and individual sacrifices that had enabled mission success despite circumstances that conventional military wisdom considered insurmountable. His recommendations influenced convoy security procedures, emergency logistics protocols, and leadership training throughout American military forces operating in hostile environments. The medical supplies delivered by Miller's convoy enabled FOB Phoenix to maintain full medical capability during a major combat operation that resulted in 347 wounded soldiers receiving life-saving treatment that would have been impossible without proper equipment. Ammunition supplies sustained intensive combat operations for 3 weeks, providing firepower advantage that contributed directly to mission success and reduced American casualties. Miller received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second-highest decoration for extraordinary heroism in combat, recognizing his individual courage and tactical brilliance that had saved thousands of American lives through successful supply delivery under impossible circumstances. The citation highlighted his willingness to risk everything for fellow soldiers and his refusal to abandon critical supplies despite overwhelming odds. More importantly for Miller personally, every soldier at FOB Phoenix understood that their continued combat effectiveness and survival had been enabled by one sergeant's refusal to follow orders that would have abandoned critical supplies. Letters from grateful soldiers and their families provided meaningful recognition that transcended official awards and formal commendations. The tactical innovations Miller developed during solo convoy operations became standard procedures taught in military logistics schools and convoy security training programs. His decision-making process, resource management techniques, and leadership under extreme stress provided case study material for officer development and NCO leadership courses throughout the military education system. Miller's story demonstrated that individual determination, tactical expertise, and selfless commitment to fellow soldiers could overcome circumstances that appeared impossible according to conventional military assessment. His successful mission provided proof that American military values of never abandoning fellow soldiers extended beyond individual relationships to encompass broader responsibilities for unit survival and mission success. The convoy's journey became legendary among American forces operating in Iraq, inspiring other soldiers to consider unconventional approaches when standard procedures proved inadequate for protecting lives and completing critical missions. Miller's reputation as a leader who would risk everything for his brothers provided moral authority and credibility that enhanced his effectiveness during subsequent operations. The supplies delivered by Miller's convoy sustained FOB Phoenix during combat operations that eliminated a major enemy stronghold, rescued captured American personnel, and secured strategic territory that had been contested for months. The tactical advantage provided by adequate ammunition and medical supplies enabled mission success that might have failed without proper logistics support. 247 wounded soldiers received life-saving medical treatment using equipment transported by Miller's convoy, representing families who remained intact because one sergeant refused to abandon supplies that conventional wisdom suggested were impossible to deliver. Each successful treatment multiplied the impact of Miller's decision to risk everything for fellow soldiers. Combat operations sustained by delivered ammunition resulted in the capture of enemy leaders, destruction of weapons caches, and disruption of terrorist networks that had threatened civilian populations throughout the region. The strategic success achieved by properly supplied American forces demonstrated the critical importance of logistic support during combat operations. Miller's convoy became a symbol of American military determination and the lengths to which individual soldiers would go to support their brothers in combat. The story inspired recruitment, improved morale among deployed forces, and reinforced public confidence in military personnel who consistently demonstrated courage and commitment beyond normal expectations. Years later, when reflecting on his decision to disobey orders and attempt the impossible convoy mission, Miller understood that his choice had been driven by fundamental military values that transcended regulations and standard operating procedures. The lives of fellow soldiers had been more important than career advancement, personal safety, or conventional tactical wisdom. Miller continued serving in logistics and convoy security roles, applying lessons learned during his solo mission to train other soldiers and develop improved procedures that would enable future success during similar crisis situations. His expertise became invaluable for planning operations where conventional approaches might prove inadequate for mission accomplishment. The psychological impact of leading a solo convoy through 50 miles of hostile territory created lasting changes in Miller's understanding of leadership, responsibility, and individual capability under extreme circumstances. He learned that ordinary soldiers could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by commitment to fellow military personnel and willingness to sacrifice personal safety for broader mission success. Miller's family understood that their husband and father had risked everything to save thousands of other families from experiencing the loss and grief that military service could create. His children grew up understanding that heroism sometimes required difficult choices and that their father had chosen other people's welfare over his own safety when circumstances demanded such sacrifice. The bond between Miller and the soldiers his convoy had supplied created lasting relationships that extended far beyond military service into civilian life, professional networks, and mutual support systems that demonstrated the enduring impact of shared sacrifice and commitment to mutual welfare during times of crisis. And that's Sergeant Miller's convoy guardian story. One man who chose to break orders to save 2,000 lives. Here at Last Signal Stories, we believe every soldier's courage deserves recognition. If this story of determination, sacrifice, and brotherhood moved you, hit subscribe for more military stories. Drop a comment below, would you have made the same choice as Miller? Until next time, stay tuned for the signal.